we have Shanker Singham. He is one of the world's leading international trade and competition lawyers and economists, which is very exciting for an economist to. Government economists usually have to work with lawyers, but when you work with a lawyer who knows economics, it's particularly special. And former advisor to the Secretary of State for International Trade of the United Kingdom. That's basically like the UK's USTR. And then also a former clear advisor to the United States Trade Representative. And currently, he leads the Competiteur, which is a advisory business where they focus on competition-related issues. Then we have, of course, our own Alden Abbott. He's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, an expert in antitrust, and he has served as the Federal Trade Commission's general counsel from 2018 to 2021, I think. So they have made the time to discuss this new book with us. And then we're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. I know we have a lot of interesting people in the audience, and I think we'll have some really good discussion afterwards. So we'll lead this off, with just a recognition in the UK and the US. Over the past 5-10 years, there have been a number of policies and ideas and new trajectories from the top down, but also from the bottom up that would seem to reflect just a misunderstanding of how markets work. And so for me, this book is just, it's as somebody, in government for 15-17 years, this would be the kind of book that I would want on my bookshelf, because it not only has the theoretical frameworking of where the three pillars really come together: domestic, economic, and regulatory policy, international trade policy, and property rights. A lot of our textbooks, will only just deal with one of those silos. This is, but then and that's great for when you're in school, but then you start practicing this. And, you realize there's a lot of gray area where these areas intersect. And that's where this book comes in. And not only in a substantive, like I said, theoretical frameworking way, but then also really connecting to real life issues and explaining how we got to where we are, and providing a roadmap to what would be a better way. So, not only a nice primer, but also a very good substantive roadmap. And it's not very often you can get two lawyers, economists to come together and write this type of book. People with so much practical experience, but then also a real strong foundational understanding of the theory. So I think we'll start off. We could. Would love to hear from you. We could perhaps start with you, Shanker. Just a review of global trade over the last few decades. How we kind of know how we got here, but from your perspective and your fascinating perch, how we got here. And I know for you in the audience, you'll hear this term a lot today. ACMD. Anti-competitive market distortions, and that how we've seen a lot of these distortions start to pop up. What sparked that, and then if you could bring in the dimensions with China.
Absolutely. So thanks very much, Christine, and thanks to Mercatus for having me. And it's a delight to be here with Alden, my co-author of many years, decades, I think, at this point. So just on your question, I think what's happened, if you look back, and what the book does, it actually goes back, very much to sort of first principles in all the three different areas that we focus on. So if you look at trade policy and trade liberalization, you go back to the ITO, International Trade Organization, 1947, the plan to have a sort of very integrated system that included things like restricted business practices and other things. And for political reasons, that sort of fell by the wayside, and you were left with this general agreement on tariffs and trade, this contract between the parties, and successive decades of liberalization of tariffs primarily, And then in the 70s, you started to see some, other things covered on a plurilateral basis in the Tokyo round. But principally, these were border barriers that were being dealt with. And when the border barriers are very high, it sort of doesn't really matter what's going on inside the market and from a trade perspective. So what we saw is the border barriers come down significantly. And then these practices inside the market, these what Alden and I have called anti-competitive market distortions, start to have bigger and bigger trade effects and start to be felt in the global economy. And this occurred, really on steroids when the former Soviet Union sort of moved towards a market economy. China WTO accession, India, Latin America moving from import substitution. You had large countries, large amounts of a global economy transitioning in this way. And those anti-competitive distortions that, or those behind the border barriers, or however you want to call them, started to have bigger and bigger effects. But we had a trading system that wasn't really able to deal with them. So you had various initiatives in the 1990s, Singapore Agreement, where we talked about trade and the intersection and the interaction between trade and competition policy. But this didn't really go very far. And then you had the sort of stasis of the Doha round, Doha development agenda not really achieving anything either. So this problem has sort of festered. And essentially what happens is when you open up the barriers at the border, but you do nothing about the conditions of competition inside the border, what happened in the 90s and 2000s was you have the oligarchs in former Soviet Union and Central Eastern Europe. You have vested interest elites in Latin America, India, etc., who essentially capturing the rents of the benefits of the reduction of the border measures. And your consumers in these markets are not seeing the benefits of liberalization because consumer welfare enhancement is not actually being achieved because the market is not actually competitive. So what I think is needed now, and that's the reason why we have been in this area and have written the book and so on, is a theory that enables us to integrate those market distortions inside the border and the trade barrier, the conventional trade barrier restrictions in a sort of holistic framework. And that framework is built on these three pillars you mentioned. So property rights protection is the fundamental one, obviously, because property rights are what firms compete with. So that's the fundamental core of it. And then competition is really, whether it's across a border or not, it has the same effect on individual consumers. So competition writ large, domestic competition, which is antitrust as well as government distortion, as well as international competition, which is trade theory. So trying to create a logistical and a sort of philosophical framework for all of that is, I think, going to be necessary. We are also, you mentioned China at the end. Obviously, there needs to be a way of, in my view, containing the threat of China market distortions, but managing the relationship with China. I mean, sometimes it's phrased as containing China, which I don't think we are going to be able to do, nor would we necessarily want to do that. But to have a robust economic tool to deal with those distortions, because they are replete in the Chinese market. There are many anti-competitive distortions, but we need a framework that actually deals with that and allows us. And in the book, we talk about the potential tarification of distortions. I think we've oscillated in the US between doing nothing at all about China market distortions to doing, national security tariffs or a blanket 25% tariff, regardless of what's happening inside the China market. And that is, both are not feasible policy tools. And so what I think we need to come up with is something that is not an attack on the nature of the Chinese market. We're not saying to the Chinese, or we shouldn't be saying to the Chinese, we just don't like your state-owned enterprises. We just don't like that system. What we should be saying, I think, to the Chinese is, you can have whatever system you like, but where you have anti-competitive market distortions that have an effect on global trade and that have an effect on our firms and our producers, we will do something about that. We will have a robust mechanism to deal with that. And actually, if you lower those distortions, then that robust mechanism, unlike trade remedies typically, will actually operate in real time to lower the tarification of those distortions, which gives a signal, I think, to the Chinese. And whether it's a signal, whether it's taken or not, is not really relevant. The fact is, we'll have something that will be in place, and I think that's the most obvious. That's the biggest problem right now facing the world in this sense. So so that's the sort of trade sort of element of it, I think, that we're trying to get across.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed. In fact, I mean, that's you can trace that directly to the holdup of the dispute settlement appellate body panel today, right? Indeed. So, and Alden, maybe this is a good time for you to talk a little bit about these anti-competitive market distortions. Where do we see them, and why should we care?
Well, thank you, Christine. Thank you, Shanker, for setting things up. Idea, but anti-competitive market distortions are really actions either directly by government or through private parties at the behest of government that affect that favor some companies, tend to selectively lower the costs of some companies as opposed to other companies. And they come in different forms. I mean, a direct government subsidy is the most obvious one. There's something called countervailing duty law but is limited in its way. But it says we don't want to directly subsidize a company or give an implicit subsidy because it'll get advantage in international trade, and that's most obvious. But there are many other types. There are things, for instance, licensing provisions. It's harder, even informally, perhaps, to get licensing provision to engage in certain business or certain trade if you're a foreign party or if you're certain companies as opposed to other companies. There are different regulations that selectively affect companies. I think some of you have heard the Internal Revenue Code is famous for writing trade or tax provisions that only affect one company, even though they're supposedly neutral. Well, it's certainly possible, and it's happened many times in this, where you have what's called rent seeking. Some politically connected companies go to state governance or go to the federal government, and they get particular regulations that disfavor their competitors or help them. It may be regulations on environmental controls, but it may be regulations, as I said, on getting licenses. It also regulations that limits the number of competitors in the market. And for instance, that's rife in the area of healthcare here, where there are certificates of public common need and so on that limit the number of competitors, but it happens in other areas too. In public procurements, sometimes procurements are designed in a way to give a boost to certain competitors as opposed to others. So these things come in different forms, but the idea is it can be measured. The idea is, ideally, and it's not easy, obviously, but if you can show how much of an advantage, relative cost advantage, is given to certain companies over others, then you can determine the potential harm. Now, when we're talking about international trade, we're talking about the distortions that affect trade flows, either foreign investment, the difficulty of getting domestic licenses, or, for example, domestic procurements. If you enter a market, may discourage foreign investments. Trade, even though tariffs have been lowered and quotas are not really allowed, there may be new, as I say, not local content or local favoritism. And you find a lot of that, for example, in subtle parts. I teach European competition law. There's some subtle parts of European competition law that really do favor European firms. over US and other foreign firms, and that's true in many countries. So what do you do about this? In some areas, regulations, and I've just skirted that, but heavy-handed regulations that favor local companies, that limit entry, that create all sorts of red tape for licenses are a big deal. India is a perfect example of that. Shanker and his economist colleagues did a study of the Indian market, and they came up with sort of an econometric estimate, because it seems there are lots of local regulatory distortions in India, that suggested if you got rid of the bulk of these distortions, India would have the 5th largest economy in the world. So even though India has moved away from socialism, it's terribly, terribly regulated. And that's true of a lot of markets. So our idea, the idea of anti-competitive market distortions, we've written about this in a variety of articles, is it would be helpful to get international trade agreements. And here's the kicker: antitrust generally isn't able to reach these. International trade law, which is focused on obvious direct subsidies and they're eliminating or lowering tariffs, doesn't reach these things. But how about multilateral trade agreements that could start reaching distortions and come up with a solution that said, if the distortion, again, this is not the minute, this major, but if you can have a measurable effect on trade, and we can estimate it, the parties that are hurt, in effect, they wouldn't be able to act against all trade from the other companies, from the other countries' companies, but the particular trade that's disadvantaged, you could have sort of a tariff that measures that, and you could have a mutual agreement, each country agreeing to be able to raise distortions by another country. You could do this with a regional trade agreement, with a bilateral trade agreement, and I know that Shanker, with his long-term work on multilateral and bilateral trade, is looking at this. And eventually, to the extent you do that, there's an opportunity for huge trade expansion that isn't being realized now. Now, there are a number of, and he's the expert on trade agreements, but there are a number of agreements. What was the Trans-Pacific Partnership? The U.S. didn't join it 6-7 years ago, and might have. It's being revived. There may be a bilateral U.S.-UK trade agreement at times. There's sort of a variety of regional agreements, and I know that Shanker and his colleagues have been looking at this very in great detail. How could you start putting provisions with teeth in trade agreements that aren't broadly protectionist, don't apply to a whole bunch of products, don't penalize a foreign economy, but are specifically targeted? And the target means that once you withdraw the distortion, the potential penalizing effect goes away. So that's what we're talking about. And we think that there's a great possibility for moving forward in the longer term. This is a longer term project, obviously, but the first thing you have to do is start getting recognition on the international level by some major trading companies and mention it to them and see if they will agree to start including such language in negotiations. And Shanker, you know a lot more about the details of that than I do, I know.
But in principle, though, wouldn't the national treatment, most favored nations, but national treatment principle kind of cover that, as well as you're trying to achieve, countries keep their sovereignty, they're free to pursue public policy goals as long as it's done in the least trade distorting way.
Yeah, least trade distorting, and we would suggest least anti-competitive way. I mean, if you look at the WTO and you look at the cases on, and we do this in the book, you look at the cases on certain areas, that you can start to see emerging in these cases elements of competition policy, what would traditionally be thought of as competition policy. So you look at, you talk about national treatment, so you look at the Article 3-4 cases on non-discriminatory taxes, for example, particularly in distilled spirits. And you're starting to see a test which moves away from the old aim and effect test in the WTO to an equality of competitive opportunity test, which is starting to look a little bit like a competition test. You look at the Article 17 case on state trading enterprises, which is really the precursor of all the problems we're having now in the WTO on public bodies. But you start to see an unpacking of what commercial considerations means that starts to look a little bit like a competition test. So you've got a trade problem that's occurring, which is your trade theory does not deal with the sort of anti-competitive market distortion piece. The subsidy world is designed to deal with, I give money to Airbus. So I'm a government, I give money to Airbus. Airbus has an advantage. Airbus can outcompete Boeing. That's what the countervailing duty agreement, subsidy agreement is designed to deal with. It's not designed to deal with, in fact, it's specifically not dealing with cases of general market distortion, so the China case where you have lots of distortion all over the market. So you've got these trade problems that don't have solutions. And then looking at the problems through the other end of the telescope, which is what Alden was talking a little bit about. What do you actually have a competitive market inside the border? Now we focused entirely or substantially when we look inside the border at private anti-competitive practices. We've looked at antitrust typically in the US. In the EU, it's slightly different because you've got a state aids discipline there. So there is some element of looking at domestic competition and looking at domestic government action. But the problem is, do you really have a competitive market inside the border, whether it's rendered anti-competitive through private activity or through government activity? Tim Meares, when he was the Federal Trade Commission chair, famously talked about, it's like only dealing with one half of the river, looking at only private antitrust. You're missing an entire area. And so the question then becomes, well, how do you get this competitive market inside the border? And in the regulatory sphere, we are in the same way that the problem is being diagnosed on the trade side, the problem of anti-competitive regulation is being diagnosed in the purely domestic side. And you have lots of initiatives to promote pro-competitive regulation. So you have the OECD's competition assessment toolkit, regulatory toolkit. You've got things like OIRA in the US looking at, what is the cost of regulation? Not just from a business, compliance cost standpoint, but from a market standpoint. Now we're fairly early stages in this, and no country has really adopted the competition assessment toolkit, let alone the ICN, the International Competition Network's competition advocacy mandate, which says to competition agencies, domestic competition agencies, where you have anti-competitive market distortions, regulations in particular sectors, you must go after them. You must, not with cases necessarily, but with advocacy. That doesn't really happen very much either. But what we'd submit is if you tackle the trade problem, you deal with the problem that the trade world is causing, or is demonstrating, through measures that deal with cases where trade liberalization gives you market access, but does not give you market contestability because there are these behind the border distortions in the other market. If you deal with that in your trade policy, if you deal domestically with your pro-competitive regulatory policy in ways that, as you said, ensure that you are regulating in the least anti-competitive, least trade restrictive way you can, consistent with a legitimate publicly stated regulatory goal. And it has to be publicly stated because a lot of bad regulation is hidden, and so publicly stating it allows it to be tested. If you do that in your domestic regulation, first of all, you're going to lower those contestability problems in the trade world. You're also going to benefit your economy. You're going to liberate GDP per capita growth in your own economy. So it's something you should be doing anyway. Of course, we don't do it, but it is something you should be doing anyway. So you do both of these things at the same time, then I think you've got a shot of getting to the world that in the book we sort of assume is the optimal situation, which is if you have a liberalized trading system, you lower trade barriers, you have pro-competitive markets inside the border, and you protect property rights, you've got the best chance of liberating GDP per capita growth into your economy. And so how do you do that? Well, these two elements are critical. But there is a third sort of point in this that needs to be understood, and it operates in both the trade world and the domestic competition world, which is, what do we mean by competition policy? Different people have very, very different visions of when I say pro-competitive market or competitive market and what that means. Now, we're pretty clear in the book about what we mean by it. What we mean by it is, and to sort of get to that point, we analyze the history of US antitrust over a century, and the history over 50, 60 years of European competition law and other countries, where they've moved from one vision of what a competitive market actually is, in the US in the 50s, for example, in Europe, 50s and 60s, 70s perhaps, very much about fragmented markets, you know, that a market of lots of small businesses was a sort of intrinsic good, which in 1968, Demsets obviously basically said we have no theory that says this. We have no theory that proves this. In fact, actually, what we want and what we suggest in the book is you want a competitive market that is defined, that basically allows productive and allocative efficiency, both productive and allocative efficiency, to be the norm, to be maximized. In that world of competition, that's where you've got the best chance of having a pro-competitive environment. Now, there are some nuances to this in the trade world, because in the trade world, and particularly when you're dealing with government distortions or government activity, the government is obviously not a profit maximizer, it's a revenue maximizer at best. Sometimes it's not even that. So the government can sustain, for example, in a predatory context, the government can sustain below cost pricing forever, you know, arguably. And therefore, when we look at the competition tests that are applied to some of these things in a private context, they have to be adapted for a government to deal with a government. I mean, you wouldn't apply, I mean, there's a famous antitrust test in the context of predatory pricing, which is the Brook Group test. You know, you have to prove that the person who's doing the predatory pricing can recoup the lost profits in the future. Otherwise, there's no point doing it. It's just bad business practice. You're just going to go out of business. Well, the government isn't going to go out of business, so you can't have that recoupment test in your sort of predatory test. You also have different measures of cost when it's a government. So there are nuances that need to be taken into account. It's not simply a case of transporting private antitrust jurisprudence and applying it to the government context. There are changes that you have to make. But broadly speaking, if you're talking about maximizing productive and allocative efficiency inside the market, you're talking about the same thing in terms of the trade context as well. You don't want to erect market contestability barriers, even though you've taken down the market access barriers that have the same damaging effect on productive and allocative efficiency. It's quite interesting that for the first time, I think we have something that we called for in a paper for the Council on Foreign Relations back in 2012, which was, we have an economy that's, we have we have cabinet members, we have a political system that is designed for a world where I make a product in country A and I sell it in country B. You know, we have a Department of Commerce, we have USTR, we have these things. And what we essentially said in 2012 was, that's not the world we live in. We live in a world of competing global supply chains. What's the most important thing in a world of competing global supply chains is efficiency. You know, getting those benefits of efficiency that lead directly to GDP per capita growth. That's the most important thing. So you should set up a government that's thinking about that. And in the UK, the recent government change has meant that we now have a department for business and trade, which is interesting. We never really had that before. It would be like fusing in the US bits of the Federal Trade Commission, Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, Commerce Department, bits of USTR into a department that is really focused on economic competitiveness. So the Secretary of State for DBT now is responsible for the regulatory reform agenda in the UK. So that pro-competitive regulatory reform, responsible for trade policy, so the whole trade liberalization element, and also has responsibility for the competition agency. So activities of the competition agency sort of fall within this overall umbrella as well. So it'll be interesting to see how whether that can actually lead to some of these policy gains that we've talked about. Because I think if you can do those, that's the name of the game. If you can do all of that, then you're going to maximize GDP per capita growth in a country.
Well, that is really exciting. How you talk about taking advantage of that clean slate after the UK put us all through the drama of Brexit. I'll never forget that morning I heard the news. But here we are many years later, and yeah, it looks like you might be able to make something really exciting out of that. Well, a lot of us will be watching that new department to see how that goes, and who knows? I mean, maybe we could learn some lessons for the US could learn some lessons from that in the future as well. You know, if you talk a lot about efficiency, and you know, for most economists, that's just, you know, we inherently, it's like in our blood. We understand it's a you know, building framework. But efficiency, Alden, has kind of gotten a bad rap. And in fact, our current USTR, Catherine Tai, has recently come out and said that the way of doing trade agreements with efficiency being the goal, that's not a goal anymore. That's no longer the way that this administration thinks about the goals of trade. And, you know, how do you look at that? You know, how did efficiency get such a bad name, Alden? And then where did the key lessons of this book come in?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And we do talk a little bit about recent developments in Europe, United States, and elsewhere. About 20 years ago, there was a sort of a transatlantic consensus that was found in both parties. You had economists on center left and center right, that promoting consumer welfare, new gains to the consumer, and also productive gains to the economy was the most important goal of antitrust. It was an economist, Mario Monti, was head of the antitrust agency in Europe. There were a few arguments over, really politicized arguments over a couple of mergers, transatlantic mergers. By and large, things seem to be moving in that direction. Even into the Obama administration, they were a bit more interventionist, but they were always, I think, generally, at first at least, pushing the idea of protection of property rights in the first 2 or 3 years, and antitrust that remained in the mainstream. The last few years of the Obama administration, and then after the Trump administration, you have a growth of people, so-called neo-Brandeisians in the United States, people who go back to the idea we want a lot of small companies. We hate big companies. So it's not always clear because often they're politically supported by big companies. But at the same time, we want to use competition policy to do a lot of things to get green goals. So we want competition rules that penalize companies that are not green enough. Labor, we want to strengthen unions. We want to make sure that the number of workers is maximized. So even if a merger temporarily costs jobs in a poorer area, even though those workers will get better jobs at higher salaries later on, that doesn't matter. You can't allow anything that's going to hurt labor. And indeed, you might want to have merger conditions that would give special benefits to labor. This is all part of an ideology that says that antitrust or competition policy really isn't about aggressive competition that over time creates greater wealth for economies around the world. There's no doubt that the pro-competitive aspect of trade liberalization brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and a great economic gains per capita. The whole approach seems to be, in effect, denying economics. The heads of the agencies, particularly Federal Trade Commission, has said that recently that we don't believe that efficiency. We think it's often harmful in mergers, and we don't believe, and we think that's fair. Fairness is the main thing. We think that an economy must be fair to everyone. What does that mean? So we want competition to help disadvantaged minorities, poor people, workers, and that has nothing to do with good competition. Europeans don't use exactly the same terms, but they emphasize the importance of cracking down, so to speak, on big platforms, of bigger government control, and of certainly green projects. There's a huge, big green initiative that is being brought into competition analysis. Why did it come about? There can be agreements or disagreements. Some say 2008, 2009, the financial crisis brought a lot of harm to a lot of consumers. There was lots of uncertainty that developed over the next few years. One theory is that meant that politicians were concerned about that. And of course, whom do you want to blame if you're a politician? Even though I think there's a lot of evidence that bad government regulation and special interest regulation had a lot to do with the collapse, it was easy enough to blame big business. I think that's part of it. I think this whole populist urge, Senator Warren, who was very prominent, argued at about 5-6 years ago, she started arguing that antitrust was destructive. There were misleading studies that suggested antitrust was a failure. Workers had done worse off, hadn't worked. You had to just rewrite it and make it an attack on big business, and beyond that, an attack on smaller businesses. Unfortunately, in the digital markets area, regulation and harder antitrust is not only cropping up for the moment in Europe, but in the UK, Australia, East Asia, and you've got departments developing. That's, I think, a moment in time. It seems to me there's a possibility you'll have some natural experiments as new regulations are brought online in Europe and elsewhere. If you don't get innovation, if you continue having inflation because too much government spending, if you don't get real benefits to workers, there will be an opportunity for a counter-reaction. But I think the important thing of the book is explaining precisely why the sort of the openness, getting rid of government restrictions that favor some companies over others, that restrict competition, broadening that globally is a way to prosperity. There's a lot of historical evidence that's true. Temporarily, populists and other special interest groups have politically powerful number of countries have said, forget all that. But the time will come, I think, we're hopeful that if the evidence shows that doesn't work, there'll be an opportunity. And the good thing is the OECD, the World Bank, other major international organizations have written the script about how you should deal with heavy-handed regulation. And there's a study of Greece, for example, of the costs of really anti-competitive market distortion. So that's where we are.
Yeah, well, and then the question is, will they hold the script, or are they going to start changing the script? Right.
Well, I think just to come back on what Alden was saying there, I think a lot of it depends on where you think we are in terms of liberating, greater levels of GDP per capita. If you think that we've essentially, I mean, it's an argument that gets replayed over and over again. It's decades old. If you go back to 1936, the American Keynes, Alden talked about. In fact, he said that in 1936 we had exhausted all technological innovation. That basically that was it. And in fact, he also said that we had also exhausted population growth. That population growth was done, that innovation was done, and therefore certain things follow. Now, if it's really a difference between a zero-sum worldview and a non-zero-sum worldview. I mean, if you think we in fact have not exhausted, and you look at whole sectors like, the planes that we fly, for example, are not very different from the planes that we flew 50, 60 years ago. Some of them are actually 40 years old. There's lots of sectors where we haven't actually made much. We tend to focus on the ones where we have, but if you look at the ones where we have, telecom being, one of them, those tend to be the sectors where there's been the most competition, the least government restraint, the least government distortion. So I would argue that we are a long way away. And in fact, our modeling of anti-competitive market distortions suggests that, in fact, we are a long way away from liberating all the gains to GDP per capita and all the gains of efficiency that we could be liberating, that in fact, there is significant distortion, even in the US, in Western Europe, in the UK, there is still significant distortion. To Alden's point, I would submit also that, in fact, we're going in the other direction now. In some developed countries, we are increasing the level of distortion in our markets. But if you look at countries like India, when we did the study of India, China, etc., most of the world, the level of distortion is still extremely high. The level of government restraint that has an adverse effect on market contestability is still extremely high. If you look at the services agreement, for example, in the WTO, you know, that was 1994. But you look at the cupboard of services, actual services liberalization that countries have given across the 4 modes of service liberalization, it's very low. Because it's a positive list. In other words, you have to put on the table the sectors you want to liberalize. If you actually look at the sectors that countries have put on the table for liberalization, it's very, very weak. And even in bilateral and regional trade agreements, it's not that significant. So, and services is a huge share of the global economy. So if you look at levels of the global economy that are actually impacted by these liberalization initiatives, there are not that many of them, number one. And number two, that doesn't even touch the level of distortions inside the market. Now, I would just also say that we coined this phrase anti-competitive market distortions because we want to be very clear that we're not saying that every market distortion, every government action has a negative effect from an economic standpoint. You have to show that there is an anti-competitive effect of the market distortion, and that will depend on the market. So that's why we want to view these things through a competition lens, a traditional competition lens, where you look at the effect of the behavior, whatever it is, on the relevant product and geographic market. I mean, you may have a market where there are multiple players, where a particular distortion that lowers, that increases costs, so you knock out maybe one competitor out of 100, has very little effect on competition. On the other hand, if you're doing that in a market where there are 2 players or 3 players, it's going to have a huge effect on competition. So it varies. And again, the trade world, the trade theory is not very good at dealing with that kind of difference in the way markets work. And therefore, it's more about getting more competition into the trade world in a sense. Because ultimately, why do we liberalize trade? We don't liberalize, well, what you will read in the newspapers is that we liberalize trade so that our export interests have better advantage in other markets. But that's not why we liberalize trade. We liberalize trade to stimulate import competition, to lower price for consumers. The purpose of liberalization of trade and the purpose of competitive markets are the same, basically. It's to ensure that consumers actually benefit. Now, we've used very cleverly in trade the mercantilist impulse. This is called our whole Reciprocal Trade Act. You know, we've used the impulse of mercantilism to force countries to liberalize trade by getting the principal suppliers and principal consumers together to give the best deal. That best deal is spread around the world through the process of MFN, and that's been very successful as with regard to tariffs. It's not very successful with regard to anything else. And that's why we've had a sort of stasis in it. So we need to, part of it is also to get publics to understand why we do this, you know, because that's not well understood now.
You're right. That reciprocity was a huge game changer in international trade, right? I'll lower my barriers if you lower yours. Doing that through tariffs was, you know, fairly straightforward and hugely successful. But now that most tariffs are fairly low, countries aren't really coming to the table and saying, well, I'll get rid of these domestic regulations if you get rid of yours, right? And that's where these things get sticky. And that's where I think this book is so really excellent, and kind of just taking a step back, taking a breath, what, where are we coming from? What are our goals, and what are the distortions currently on the table, at least in the domestic market, and that intersection of trade.